Good evening. I'm Paul Singer, Chairman of the Manhattan Institute's Board of Trustees. That's a good start. I like that. And I'd like to welcome all of you to the 29th annual consecutive Wriston lecture. I say consecutive. Thank you. I say consecutive because the lecture has been held every year, come hell or high water, a phrase which perfectly sums up the election of Mayor de Blasio. These lectures not only bear Walter Wriston's name, they also share the conviction that characterized his life, that it is essential to take ideas seriously. That conviction and the Manhattan Institute's dedication to putting it into action is as vital today as ever. As we consider the present state of the country, we're reminded that democratic societies frequently are at times prone to amnesia. That's the only way to account for how it's become fashionable to call oneself a socialist, despite the long history of misery caused by that ideology. It is also the only way to account for those who romanticize the gritty old days of the city, the era, let's not forget, when Time magazine reported that nearly 6 in 10 New Yorkers wanted to leave. And it's the only way to account for those who look at a decades-long decline in crime and conclude that it's now time to throw open the doors of our prisons. This is the nature of life in a democracy. When success begins to feel inevitable, complacency and confused thinking often set in. In that atmosphere, it's not enough to be right. You have to be right and persistent and persuasive. That's why we should all be grateful that on the most pressing issues of our time, the Manhattan Institute continues to shape the debate and, as a result, the course of human events. Let me give a concrete example. In the 1990s, New York City was blessed by political leadership that transformed our city, a transformation that was built on ideas that the Manhattan Institute championed. But New York City is now being led by a man with a very different set of ideas. The results have been decline and greater human hardship, but the Institute has responded fully and forcefully. The research coming out of this institution plays a key role in the current debates over effective policing methods, the success of charter schools, and the administration's failed attacks on Uber and other businesses. That's what the best think tanks in the world do. Help us think more deeply and wisely about public matters, build support for sound policies, and translate those policies into the real world. One of the reasons the Manhattan Institute is the premier think tank in the world is that it understands how to make abstract ideas concrete and real in our daily lives, in our schools and businesses, on our streets, and in our neighborhoods. One of the things that sets apart the Manhattan Institute, of course, is City Journal. Excuse me. Next week, the magazine will celebrate its 25th anniversary, and it remains one of the only publications in America that truly deserves the adjective indispensable. If anyone doubts that fact, you need only point them to Heather McDonald's masterful essay in the new issue. The Decriminalization Delusion, a powerful piece whose final paragraph opens with the sentence, "The demonization of the police and criminal justice system must end," and closes with the warning, "We are playing with fire." Of course, it's not just on the domestic side that we are relearning lessons that we should have long ago taken to heart. The same is true on the international stage. Over the last several years, we've been running an experiment on what happens when America abstains from its role as a global leader. While there are those in Washington who seem to believe that the jury is still out, for the rest of us, the results are in, and they are unambiguous. The world is a more dangerous place in the absence of American global leadership. If you want to understand the international landscape with precision, there are few voices as valuable and certainly provocative as the one which belongs to the speaker I'm honored to introduce tonight. Robert Kaplan is the best-selling author of 16 books, a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. And those are only the most recent entries on a resume that also includes stints as the chief geopolitical analyst at Stratfor, a visiting professor at the United States Naval Academy, and a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. As you will learn momentarily, Mr. Kaplan is one of our most prominent foreign policy thinkers on the basis of sheer intellectual horsepower alone. But what truly sets him apart is a gift all too rare in the world of international affairs, a penchant for bold, unambiguous clarity. Tonight, building off the work in his most recent book, Asia's Cauldron, the South China Sea and the End of a Stable Pacific, he will give us a tour of the horizon in a region that will no doubt be central to the history of the 21st century. Hailed by the Weekly Standard as one of our most consequential political thinkers, geopolitical thinkers, and by Foreign Policy magazine as one of the top 100 global thinkers, he is precisely the right man for the job. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Mr. Robert Kaplan.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here to speak at the Manhattan Institute. It's thanks to the Manhattan Institute and a constellation of other organizations, be it the New Criterion, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and others, that allow for a real debate to happen in the United States. Because without these organizations, there would be much less of a debate. There would just be a lot of many sides of the same point of view. So I want to thank you for that, and it's a great privilege to be here. Let me start in. For too many years, the word geopolitics has been consigned to something that's amoral, cynical, something that moral people don't engage in. In fact, that idea was put to rest in 1942 in a brilliant book by a University of Pennsylvania political scientist, Robert Strauss Hupé, who is an Austrian immigrant from Europe in the 1930s, who loved this new country but felt it was naive in terms of dealing with the world. And in his book, Geopolitics, The Battle for Space and Power, Hupé delineated how Hitler had used geopoliticians like Karl Haushofer and others to organize a plan to take over East and Central Europe. And Hupé's conclusion was not that geopolitics was amoral and cynical, but that the competition between states over geographical space had been going on since antiquity. And if the United States did not engage in it, then all that would happen would be the people who were evil in the world would engage in it and would have no competitors. That geopolitics was too important and too valuable to be left to the likes of Haushofer and Hitler. And therefore, he exhorted his new country to take it up as a balancer. And this was at a time, the book was published in 1942, when the war was not going well at all. When victory, the post-World War II world was barely imaginable. And Strauss Hupé had to energize his countrymen to how to fight this battle. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about geopolitics in the second decade of the 21st century. Now, there's a myth out there that globalization and the communications revolution have negated geopolitics. That's exactly wrong. Globalization and the communications revolution have in fact reinforced geopolitics. It's like my watch. The world is smaller because of globalization and the communications revolution. But that just means that every part of the world interacts with every other part of the world as never before. That territory is fought over with a ferociousness that's rare in history. And that if a great power like the United States loses its reputation for power in one part of the world, it will affect its reputation for power in all other parts of the world as never before in history. And therefore, because of globalization and technology, geopolitics is more important than ever. I believe it was Secretary of State Kerry who said, territory doesn't matter anymore. That's 180 degrees wrong. Territory matters more importantly now than ever before. And I could talk for an hour tonight about how territory matters in the Middle East, how it matters especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but the topic for tonight's discussion is Asia. So I will concentrate on Asia and with the ideal that we cannot leave geopolitics to the likes of Haushofer and others, and their equivalents or mild equivalents in the second decade of the 21st century. All right, let me get into it. You all know how important the Mediterranean is. The Mediterranean was the center of Europe throughout antiquity up until the Islamic thrust across North Africa in the 8th century essentially separated North Africa from the rest, from Europe to the north. All right, we know that. My point is that there are 3 Mediterraneans in the world. First, there was the European Mediterranean. Secondly, there was a Dutch-American geopolitician in the 1940s at Yale, Nicholas Spykman, called the American Mediterranean. And what he meant was the Greater Caribbean. As Spykman pointed out, what really divided North and South America, or the Western Hemisphere, was not North and South America. It was the Amazonian jungle. That was the real dividing point. And every place north of the Amazonian jungle was part of the northern part of the Western Hemisphere. By taking control of the Greater Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th century, as the United States did, it effectively got strategic control of the Western Hemisphere. And by taking effective control of the Western Hemisphere, it was able to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere. And that's what the history of the 20th century was all about. The United States tipping the balance in its favor in 2 world wars and the Cold War that followed. But it all started by taking control of the Greater Caribbean. All right, my point is that there's a 3rd Mediterranean. There's not just the Mediterranean in Europe or the American Mediterranean in the Caribbean. There is the Asian Mediterranean. And the Asian Mediterranean is the South China Sea, or the Greater South China Sea. The South China Sea is the throat of international commerce. We live in the jet age, but I've got news for you. 90% of all commercial goods that travel from one continent to another do so by sea. And it's because of the United States Navy that the SLOCs, the sea lines of communication, are secure throughout the world, confining piracy as an exotic nuisance at the edges of the battle space. And the South China Sea is where all the sea lines of communication come together. Why is that? Because the Indian Ocean is the global energy interstate, transferring all the oil and natural gas from the Middle East to the middle-class conurbations of Asia and Japan, coastal China, South Korea. And all the oil tankers and all the container ships have to come through the South China Sea. The Strait of Malacca, which is the entranceway to the South China Sea from the Indian Ocean, handles 3 times as much oil on a given day as the Suez Canal, and 15 times as much as the Panama Canal. The South China Sea includes these are important countries take the Philippines. The United States became a great imperial-like power because of the Philippines. The Philippines was the first major, highly populous country that the United States invaded, occupied, and developed over the course of many decades. Before there was a South Korea, before there were other countries where the United States got deeply involved, there was the Philippines in 1899. And throughout the whole course of the 20th century, the United States was the major power in the Philippines. Were China to become the major power in the Philippines, that would be more of a devastating statement about American power in the world than anything that could happen in Iraq or Syria, from an historian's point of view at least. You have Vietnam. Vietnam is a new de facto ally of the United States. The Vietnamese are redeveloping Cam Ranh Bay Naval Station. They're redeveloping Tan Son Nhut Air Base, all these place names and date lines from the Vietnam War. Why? So that American planes and warships can visit. The Vietnamese always say to visitors, we fought 1 major war with the United States and about 17 with China. And we need the United States to balance and hedge against China. Vietnam, with a population of 89 million, is the new maritime Turkey, so to speak. Power and relationships are about shared interests, and few countries in the world have shared strategic interests with the United States like Vietnam does. Malaysia plays the game of being friendly with China. Meanwhile, it depends on 150 visits of American warships each year to keep China off its back. There's Singapore, which you all know about, which is probably pound for pound the most impressive military country in Asia. Singapore, which was as poor as the poorest countries in Africa in the 1960s, is now probably the best place in the world to do business due to the genius of one man. This is how individuals matter in history, Lee Kuan Yew. And there are and then there's Taiwan. Taiwan is the northern cork in the bottle to the South China Sea. It's what unites and separates the South China Sea from the East China Sea, where China and Japan are engaged in a debate, in a conflict. Taiwan, along with Poland and Israel, are what I consider the 3 iconic democracies. Iconic because it's where American strategy and values all come together. Taiwan is on the rimland, only 98 miles from China. Poland has the longest border with Ukraine than any individual country in Eastern Europe and is close to Russia. Let me tell you something about Taiwan and Poland, and to a lesser extent, Israel. A few weeks ago, President Obama was asked by an interviewer why the Israelis and other allies should trust the United States. And he said, that's because we're leading on climate change. All right. Let me tell you something about climate change. It's not to disparage climate change. I'm not getting into a debate about that. It's that on one level at least, and this is the heart of my talk tonight, Climate change is a values-driven issue that is a luxury for a country that is in a very favored geographical position. The United States is bordered by two oceans with the Canadian Arctic to protect it to the north and a thin band of middle-class Canadian population to the north, and honestly, a modest, moderate demographic problem with Mexico to the south. Compared to most countries in the world, that is a very favored situation to be in. And because if you're in such a favored geography, you have the luxury of the well-worried to promote climate change as your number one issue. Countries like Taiwan and Poland and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Vietnam and Japan, some of which I just mentioned are formal treaty allies of the United States, others of which are de facto allies. They don't have that luxury because their geographies are very tragic. It's precisely because we're isolated geographically, our major allies are far away from us on the rimland, somewhere near the main autocratic great powers of Eurasia, China and Russia. They don't have that luxury. And because they don't have that luxury, they're not especially mollified or convinced when an American president says, "Trust me, because I'm leading on climate change." This is the problem, that territory, old-fashioned territory in geopolitics matters precisely because of globalization and the information age, and how if you lose the respect of your allies in one part of the world, it will affect how you're treated in another part of the world. I was in Poland last summer, and Poles kept asking me about the South China Sea. Why? Because Poland is a rimland iconic ally of the United States and is terrified that the United States will lose its reputation for power in Asia. All right, what does the South China Sea signify to China? What does it mean? Why are the Chinese so ambitious about it, so driven about it? It's because to China, the South China Sea means the same to them as the Caribbean meant to us in the 19th and early 20th century. I even had a Chinese senior colonel, that's an actual rank in the Chinese military, senior colonel, said to me, "Why should we be any different in the South China Sea than you Americans were in the Caribbean?" And he knew the history of the Caribbean very well. The dominance of the South China Sea gives China several things. Number one, it gives its navy, which I'm always leery of linear thinking, because linear thinking always has discontinuities in it that you cannot predict. But if you were to engage in linear thinking, if China keeps going the way it's going, it's going to have the largest land-based navy in history in the 2030s. Land-based because of its missiles all along the coast. It gives this budding Chinese navy access to the wider Pacific. Dominance of the South China Sea allows China to soften up Taiwan, because China's goal in Taiwan is not to fight a war with it, not to invade it, but to make an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty, to engulf it. So that's why China has 1,500 to 1,750 ballistic missiles focused on Taiwan. It's also because there are hundreds of commercial flights each week transferring businessmen between Taiwan and mainland China. It's both. It's how can China incorporate Taiwan without ever firing a shot in anger at the U.S. Navy. And dominance of the South China Sea allows China to do this. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, if China were able to push the U.S. Navy away from the South China Sea through anti-access area denial and other methods, it would effectively be not just be a one-ocean navy in the Western Pacific, it would be a two-ocean navy and air force in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean, as I said, is the global energy interstate. It also encompasses the entire arc of Islam, from the Sahara Desert to the Malay Archipelago. Think of the Strait of Malacca as the Panama Canal. Were China ever to gain dominance in the South China Sea, it would gain dominance or control or influence all the way from literally East Africa all the way up to the Sea of Japan. In other words, the entire navigable rimland of Eurasia, because northern Eurasia is ice-blocked many months of the year. So the stakes are high for China. China is going to keep doing what it's doing. There's no way we're going to convince China through rational argument that it shouldn't be doing what it's doing in the South China Sea, because its geopolitical interests are similar there as was American geopolitical interests in the Caribbean in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We're ending a 500-year period of Western dominance of the Indian Ocean and Western Pacific. There were the Portuguese with Vasco da Gama, then the Dutch Empire, then the French in the southern third of India, then the British East India Company, the British Empire, and finally the U.S. Navy and Air Force after World War II, which is plateauing out. Our Navy and Air Force is not getting any bigger. We all know the problems with our defense budgets, and we see the rise of indigenous powers for the first time in 500 years. And those indigenous powers are primarily India and China. Think of India moving horizontally along the Indian Ocean and China moving vertically south to the Indian Ocean. It's not just about China gaining dominance in the South China Sea. It's about China building or helping to finance state-of-the-art, postmodern, deep-water ports in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, at Gwadar near the entrance to the Persian Gulf, in Bagamoyo in Tanzania, in East Africa, and elsewhere. China is slowly erecting a maritime commercial empire all the way from the Eastern Mediterranean to East Asia. And that's not an exaggeration, because who is taking control of the ports of Piraeus in Greece and Rijeka in Croatia? It's the Chinese. It's Chinese companies. Empires are not born by a bunch of men meeting around a table and conspiring. They emerge gradually, organically, through tremendous economic dynamism that sustained capitalism or pseudo-capitalism leads to a lot of good things, but it also leads to military acquisitions. Because once a state becomes wealthy enough, it trades more with the outside world. And when it trades more with the outside world, it suddenly has interests to protect that it didn't have before. And with those interests come an element of prestige and national status, the feeling that we, China, deserve to have a great navy, a great air force, great cyber warfare capabilities, and all the rest. And that is what China is really developing. It's been said in the last few years that technology means that geography doesn't matter, that territory doesn't matter. Secretary Kerry said something like this. Here's the reality. Again, take India and China. India and China throughout history had very little to do with each other. There were exceptions. The spread of Buddhism in Middle Antiquity, the 19th century Opium Wars, but generally there were two great world civilizations separated by the Himalayas. But thanks to technology, Chinese fighter jets include the Indian subcontinent in their arc of operations. Indian intercontinental ballistic missiles are now targeted at Chinese cities. You have Indian warships in the South China Sea. You have Chinese warships throughout the Indian Ocean. Technology has created a new strategic geography that has brought India and China into a state of rivalry. I won't say conflict. I don't want to exaggerate. Rivalry. And that's why India, precisely because where it is located, without any strategic agreement with the United States, the better India does, the better it is for the United States. Because India, in and of itself, by building its military and its economy and where it's located, acts as a hedge and a balancer against versus China. As I said, China will keep doing what it's doing. China's goal is to eventually become the hegemon of the Western Pacific, but without ever firing a shot at the U.S., because China knows that they're still at least a generation away from parity with the U.S. Navy, maybe 2 generations. Anyone who's ever been on a destroyer or a submarine for weeks at a time like I have, know it's not just a matter of technology, it's a matter of seamanship and tradition and training, which China is still far behind us. That's why China is using slow, incremental steps. Building man-made islands, reclamation projects, using its Coast Guard, not its Navy, to harass Filipino methods. All these little incremental steps, like death by slow torture, so that if we respond to any of them, we seem to be overreacting. It's a brilliant strategy. The Chinese are far more elegant than the Russians, at this kind of thing, at taking over a region. If I was giving a talk tonight on Central Europe, it would be a different talk in some ways. And the United States is caught between extremes. On the one hand, the United States does not want to have a shooting war with China. On the other hand, the United States cannot let countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, and others be Finlandized by China. What I mean by that is, think of Finland during the Cold War. It was democratic, it was capitalistic, but its foreign policy was written in Moscow. It was not allowed to join NATO. And that's what China's goal is for the countries of the South and East China Sea, to slowly, incrementally Finlandize them. The United States has to respond, not allow that to happen, and at the same time try to avoid a war with China. Some observations here. First of all, why is all this news about the South and East China Sea? What's going on? Why didn't we read about this 10 or 20 years ago? It's because if you think about it, during the Cold War and immediately after, all these countries in Asia were internally preoccupied. China was preoccupied for decades with Mao Zedong's internal depredations, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. And then came Deng Xiaoping, and he was interested, he put all his energy into pseudo-capitalist development of the economy, which again was internally occupied. Vietnam and Malaysia were occupied with internal wars and rebellions, as we Americans know very well. China was in a semi-pacifistic state as a result of its terrible experience with militarism during World War II. Singapore was still developing. The Philippines was involved with internal wars. So these disputes over who owned what territory in the Western Pacific were simply not operable. But over time, China developed its economy and started developing a great Navy and Air Force. Singapore did the same. This internal situation in the Philippines became alleviated. Vietnam has been a pseudo-capitalist dynamo for decades already. Suddenly, all those countries have gotten strong. They've institutionalized, developed bureaucracies. Japan has slipped out of quasi-pacifism and rediscovered nationalism, and they're all pressing out. And in pressing out, they suddenly discover, lo and behold, that they have all these disputes that they can't seem to settle. Some other points. China, the most important element in Asia is China's economy. I've spent weeks and weeks and weeks traveling around China, and I can tell you this is not a 6.9% growing economy. This is maybe a 3 or 4% growing economy. This is economy in trouble. And an economy in trouble means more ethnic disputes within China, more social tensions, and that means more nationalist aggression outside in the South and East China Sea, because nationalism can be easily dialed up to unify the country or an attempt to unify the country. So the worse China's economy gets, the more truculent it will likely get in the Western Pacific and the seas of Asia. Another point. We've all complained about China's authoritarianism, but the last 30 years in China were easy. We had a collegial, risk-averse, non-charismatic group of autocrats, more or less, going back beyond Jiang Zemin to Deng Xiaoping. The next 30 years are not going to be so easy. The next 30 years, you're going to see more charisma, more central control, a country going from a developing country to a full-fledged national security state under Xi Jinping. Two other final points. We live in a maritime world. It's through our Navy and Air Force that we project power on a daily basis across large swaths of the globe. The world is in a lot of disorder, but the degree to which it's not, the degree to which it's peaceful, is because we have a United States Navy of 300 warships, which, as I said, keeps the sea lines of communication open. A world with 200 American warships, say, or 225 warships, would be a far more violent world, where you could have, interstate war between China and India, between China and Japan. The Navy is totally unappreciated because everyone takes it for granted. And the Navy, and keeping up these number of warships, given the procurement problem and the budgets we could get into in the question and answer period, is going to be very, very, very hard. If you look at what's going on in Iran, with Iran projecting power, the weakening of Greece, the collapse of Syria, you see a chipping away of the maritime rimland that was the real strategic victory in the Cold War for the United States. It semi-surrounded the former Soviet Union and now Russia, and now everywhere from the South China Sea to Iran projecting power in the Persian Gulf to the weakening of Greece, you see what you see is a chipping away of this power, because Greece is very strategic, because it really unites the Eastern Mediterranean with Europe. I'm going to end with something that an old Romanian communist told me in 1998 before he died. He was the grand old man of Romanian communism. His name was Silviu Brucan. And he said to me, I asked him, why were you a Stalinist? Why were you a communist? And he said, because I grew up under Stalin and Hitler. And you people in the West, he was very accusatory, you didn't desert us at Yalta. You deserted us 7 years before at Munich. Because when Chamberlain gave in to Hitler at Munich over Czechoslovakia, he was really signing away all of Central and Eastern Europe. And we had nowhere to go except to Stalin. He said, you people in the West deserted us at Munich way before you deserted us at Yalta. If you look at the South China Sea, if you look at Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe, you look at the rimland, the iconic democracies all around the world, the only reason these places survive and prosper is because of the projection of American power. If we can project our power, our ideals can follow. But if we do not project our power, our ideals have far less of a chance. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I'll field the questions. Yeah. So I'm sure we have a lot of questions. Big crowd. Just raise your hand and wait for the microphone to get to you, and I'll acknowledge you. And actually, Michael Fedak right there. Why don't we try that for the first question?
Yes, hi. That was a brilliant overview of the situation, but you've been portrayed as a supporter of Obama's Iranian deal, and I would just like to know how you reconcile these two visions.
Yes. You're referring to a piece I wrote in the January-February issue of The Atlantic, January-February 2015, and my point was that theoretically, for a superpower to have good relations with the Sunni powers, it should also be talking with the leading Shia power. That U.S. and Iranian interests overlapped somewhat in Yemen. It overlapped somewhat in Syria and in other places, and I explained why. In Yemen, the enemy of the Iranians is al-Qaeda. The U.S. enemy is al-Qaeda. In Syria, in Iraq, we're both fighting the Islamic State. But I also said this in the whole second half of the article, is that a rapprochement with Iran can only work if the United States moves even closer to its allies. Because a rapprochement with a former enemy can only work when the power doing the rapprochement has no distance between itself and its allies, and also projects power, in a very convincing way in the region of the world that we're speaking of. The Obama administration has not projected power. When you expect Israel and Saudi Arabia to trust you because you're leading on climate change, that's not exactly projecting power. But it's also something else. Something that was really made an example of by Henry Kissinger in the 1970s. He and Nixon retreated with blood in Vietnam, very bloodily, because they needed to show their allies around the world that they were tough, that they could be trusted. Because of the way they retreated from Vietnam, even though it was portrayed very badly in this country, King Hussein, the Israeli leaders, and others took them seriously in the Middle East. The Obama administration, unfortunately, has very bad optics in terms of projecting power, and that's putting it mildly. Theoretically, a rapprochement with Iran can work, but it would take a whole different regional strategy than the one which this administration has actually put forward.
Thank you. Another question? Who's over in the corner there? Ken Bialkin?
Thank you for the Tour de Horizon. In your Tour de Horizon, you did not say a word about Russia, which is a small party. My question is whether there is a unity of interest between the United States and Russia, or whether there is a status of adversity and enmity between the United States and versa. What I'd ask you to analyze is the geopolitical and economic interests of each of the countries, and whether or not it makes sense for Obama to classify Russia as an enemy when both countries are market economies. Russia may be a dictatorship, but so is every other place in the world. Russia has a greater problem than we do with radical Islam, threatening so many of their areas. And wouldn't it be wise for the United States to try to see the merits of alliances with Russia, rather than Obama to advertise Russia as an enemy and then ally himself with Russia in Syria?
Yes, here's the problem. Foreign policy, a successful foreign policy means that your rhetoric has to be more or less in line with your actions. In other words, if you say to the world, Assad must go, and then you do nothing, that's not aligned rhetoric. If you say to the world, Assad must stay, and you help him stay, well, that may not be a great policy, but at least it's coherent in a sense. There's no coherency in our policy in Syria is regard to the Russians in the Ukraine. Here's our problem: the Europeans. The Europeans have no appetite to continue the sanctions past the end of December. Absolutely none. They're besieged by refugees. Their economy is flat. The European economies are more or less flatlining. When you read about higher growth, it's just the ball bouncing off the bottom. They have done no structural reforms, and they desperately want to get rid of the sanctions against Russia to spur commerce. Also, the Europeans are addicted to Russian natural gas and whole bunch of other features. So it's hard for us to have a confrontational policy with Russia over Ukraine when the Europeans really don't have our back. That being said, we have a company of Marines in each of the Baltic states. You know what a company is? It's 150 men. The highest ranking American military official in each of the Baltic states is a captain in his late 20s or early 30s. That's not exactly a tripwire. That's not a credible tripwire. We had many more forces in Macedonia against Serbia under the elder Bush administration, and that was a credible tripwire. That kept the war in the Balkans from spreading into Macedonia. So that, again, our rhetoric is not aligned with our actions. Sure, there's an overlapping of interests with Russia in certain spheres. We both want to defeat the Islamic State. Russia doesn't want Ukraine inside NATO, but I'll tell you the truth, NATO doesn't want Ukraine inside NATO. The United States may want it, but the other members of NATO don't want it. The EU doesn't want Ukraine inside the EU. It wants it as just like an associate member of the EU. So that it's very hard to have an aggressive policy towards Russia and the Ukraine. And in terms of Syria, I would say our policy is completely incoherent. Whether you believe Assad should stay or he should go, either way it's incoherent. Because when you have rhetoric that's 180 degrees opposite to what you're actually doing on the ground, it doesn't make sense.
Okay. Ken Gilman there.
You mentioned the Baltics. Do you have any sense as to whether Putin would attempt to subvert one of the Baltic NATO states, and whether Article 5, anyone has an appetite to invoke it?
Yeah, Article 5 is not the issue. I'll tell you why. The 21st century Russian form of imperialism is not invasion, which is what Article 5 protects against. It's subversion. It's buying off media through third parties. It's buying off corrupt politicians and weak democracies. It's using a pharaonic network of energy pipelines to subvert economies. It's by running intelligence operations. This has been the Russian method of imperialism in Central Eastern Europe and in the Caucasus since Putin's come to power. And of course in the Baltic states. So what Russia will try to do is it will try to precipitate more so-called frozen crises. A frozen crisis is a neither nor of a crisis that that the Russians can subvert a democracy in Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, or more likely in Moldova, towards the Balkans. And what we will do, or the Europeans will do, is rather than react to it, we'll send fact-finding commissions to see if there's such a crisis in the first place, and we'll argue with ourselves about it. That's the method by which the Russians operate. Now, in the short term, I think the Russians will do nothing through the end of the year because they're hoping to get the Europeans to end the sanctions. And also, the Russians being aggressive in Syria, but doing nothing for the moment in Ukraine and elsewhere serves Russian interests because they can say to the Europeans, we're going to help stop the flow of refugees from Syria. and at the same time get rid of the sanctions because we're not doing anything more in the Ukraine. And that will leave the United States with holding the bag completely. The place that's in the news that's a sleeper issue is Moldova, which is coming apart at the seams right now, and which is probably the next country on Putin's hit list.
Okay, another question? Let's go back there for a minute, right? Gentleman with his hand up. Can you get to him? Yeah, that one right there.
Analyze the vulnerability or likelihood of a cyber attack by either China or Russia. If they believe they have deniability, just to prove a point that they have this edge and can partially humiliate the U.S. by, for example, taking down the electric grid.
Yeah, to an extent, we're already in a cyber war with China. Chinese attacks against U.S. companies, against the U.S. government, the Chinese have all of my personal records. I was on the Defense Policy Board. I went through a whole security vetting. The Chinese have all of those documents already. 20, I don't know how many Americans. So we already are in a somewhat of a cyber war with China. One of the Russian incursion into Syria was interesting in many respects, but one, because it was an opportunity for Russia to show off what it can do. Firing weapons, missiles from the Caspian Sea, etc. It was sort of a coming out party for the new Russian military. And the Russian military has used cyber attacks in the Baltic States. Cyber warfare was an element of their attack into Georgia in 2008. This is the future. People who say there won't, cyber should not be part of war were sort of the same people who said the ocean should not be part of war when Columbus started sailing. No, really, there was a movement that we should keep the oceans peaceful and not be part of war. Any place of human activity will be a theater of warfare in the present and in the future. So we should expect all future conflicts to have a cyber element. And if a cyber attack is particularly intrusive, as you indicated, like an attack on an electric grid of a major American city, it could be answered by a conventional means, by B-52s or something like that. And that's just not me talking. That's what defense officials have been saying for years.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. David, Malpass, you had your hand up.
Thank you. How should we project power into the South China Sea? And could you discuss the procurement problems in that context of aircraft carriers, F-35, they're talking about the B-3, and whatever other procurement issues? Thanks.
Yes. Air and naval platforms are very expensive. A Gerald R. Ford supercarrier without anything on the on its surface is $12 billion. Once you put the fighter jets on there and everything else, it's $18 billion. A new Zumwalt-class destroyer is $4 billion. The F-22 is $120 million per plane. One of the reasons for these prices is that the procurement process is particularly hard because of, number one, everyone wants to put everything on these ships or planes because they don't want to be blamed for not having it if it's ever in a conflict and needs it. So they overload the platform with everything and it gets to be this expensive. Another problem is that very few companies comparatively can build these things. You know, why do we all have Apples, computers? Why don't we have 120 different kinds of computers? Well, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, there's a half a dozen of them, and, they control the marketplace. But it's a real problem with how to get the procurement, how to have a real reform in the procurement process, because the time it takes for us to approve and build something at astronomical costs, other countries will increasingly just steal the technology. Our technological advantage is decreasing year by year for a lot of different reasons. In the South China Sea, you may have read a week ago or 2 weeks ago, we sailed a U.S. guided missile destroyer inside the 12-mile limit near one of these Chinese man-made islands, claiming it wasn't an island. These reclamation projects were illegitimate. We need to do this regularly and all the time, and our allies need to do this. Doing something once is a stunt. It cannot be a stunt. It has to be something you do regularly, and the Chinese will adjust to it. They will adapt to it, and it probably took weeks and weeks and weeks of debates within the Obama administration whether or not to send this one guided missile destroyer within this 12-mile limit. This should have happened a long time before. Again, the Chinese are going to keep doing what they're doing, and the only way to avoid a war with China and at the same time keep China from Finlandizing these countries is to set parameters, to set limits, to make sure that the Chinese know what it is that's acceptable to us.
Thank you, Robert. You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.